Fluidity was the name of the game for Arteta, as Arsenal changed up their tactics in this 2-1 win against Forest, with goals coming from Nketiah and Saka. But how did the Gunners change their tactics compared to the Community Shield just a few days ago? Let's take a look. When Arsenal were in possession, Forest were looking to defend with their back five spread, allowing their wing-backs to be in close proximity with the Arsenal wingers who tended to hold the width in this phase. But their front five was much more narrow in this first phase, with the front three looking to use their cover shadows to prevent the ball into the midfield, backed up by their double pivot. And Arsenal's build-up shape was variable, but for the most part, their back five in the build-up was in a 3-2 shape, primarily with Partey inverting alongside Rice, with White, Saliba and Timber forming the back three, which would naturally allow Odegaard and Havertz to push up higher into the half space, creating that 3-box-3 that we've seen recently. But things would quickly change for Arsenal. But one thing that should be noted is that Arteta's vision of having extreme positional fluidity continues to grow. As to form this 3-2, we could easily see Partey becoming one of the centre-backs, or Rice could do the same, dropping into the back line. If they were building in more of a back four, White could be the widest man, but Partey, who was the right back on paper, could also hold the width when it was necessary. Whilst on the left-hand side we could see Timber wider, or even in the half space, with Rice also happy to drop into centre-back. But this was the most common shape. However, with Forest defending so narrow, the spaces for Arsenal in the build-up were in the wider regions, and they looked to take advantage of this in different ways. Initially, as the Forest front three were not pressing too high up the pitch, Timber could occupy a much more traditional left-back role, and look to receive the first pass. However, this did have some problems. It would mean that the wider forward could initially be narrow, using his cover shadow to prevent the ball into the pivots, and then once the ball went wide, he could then press Timber, whilst again still looking to keep Rice in his shadow, whilst the pivot could remain deeper on the man in the half space, and the front two potentially shift across. So what we quickly began to see was Arsenal settle into a much more dedicated back three shape, with Timber and White either side of Saliba. So now, when Timber did receive that initial pass, Timber would still draw the wider forward, but now there was still space in that wider region, and it was Havertz who tended to drop into this zone to receive the first pass, whilst we could see similar occurrences on the right-hand side, with Odegaard dropping into a pseudo right-back position in this phase. What this would now mean is that the wider man was much more likely to receive space, because the pivot would be reluctant to come across and leave massive spaces in the midfield. So instead, Havertz could potentially look to push forward and begin the left-hand side overloads that Arsenal loved in this match, but we'll touch on that soon. Down the right-hand side, Arsenal could instead look to use these opportunities to isolate Saka, either by giving him the ball to feed to be 1-versus-1 with the wing-back, or what we often saw was Saka making the run down the outside and a midfielder, either Partey or Odegaard, looking to chip in the ball over the top to him. But for the most part, if Arsenal did build down the right, it was much easier for Forest to look to attempt a 2-versus-1 because they knew the danger of Saka, as we saw with the goal. So this was a frequent occurrence. But again, when Arsenal used the left-hand side overload, this changed things. If Arsenal were able to get past this first line of pressure, the midfield shape would change once again from this box shape. The double pivot would dissolve into a single pivot instead, with Partey being the holding man, and Havertz would move to attacking midfield, with Odegaard and Rice being given extreme freedom to push right up into this left-hand half space, so that it looked like a 3-1-3-3 or a 3-4-3 diamond in these phases, which gave Arsenal a lot more options. What it would mean is that now they had a 3-versus-2 against Forest's double pivot, and often Havertz would draw both men, giving Arsenal the option to build either through Rice or Odegaard. But despite these positions, what's important to note is that this was not a performance hyper-fixated on positional play by Arteta, and the players had a lot of freedom to drift. In fact, in these scenarios down the left-hand side, when Rice received the ball, we would often see Havertz also look to move into this left-hand side region. And this would begin the overload, which could at times be made even worse by Timber overlapping to allow Martinelli to occupy more central regions. So in these scenarios with Arsenal on the ball, if a centre-back looked to press the man on the ball, there was space for potentially Martinelli or the extra midfield runner to make a move into. But what could also happen is that both of the midfielders will be forced across to try and cover, and Odegaard could be deeper initially to look to receive the outlet if Arsenal looked to work it across, but he was also just as happy to occupy more central zones to increase that overload once again, and this would now free Saka to receive a potential switch, and it would be much more difficult for Forrest to enact that 2 versus 1 against Saka in these situations, giving him the opportunity to run at his man instead. And White from deep could also look to overlap and use his pace to make the difference. But in the second half, with Timber injured and Tomiyasu in his stead, Arsenal changed their build-up shape once again, as now rather than beginning with this box midfield in the build-up stage, Forest were now also more keen to allow Tomiyasu to receive the ball initially, as he has less dynamism, and the priority would still be tying up the double pivot, with the wide forward only advancing once Tomiyasu was making progress. So instead, Arsenal switched to their diamond much earlier, instead this time doing so in the deep build-up phase, with Rice now picking up the ball in the left-back zone much more often. And once again, the midfield was happy to shift across. What we could see is Aurier looking to close down Rice, forcing Boris to switch to a back four, and potentially opening up momentary gaps. If it was not Aurier, as Rice advanced, Bolly could be drawn in, once again creating gaps that Martinelli or Havertz could look to exploit. And if too much room was given to Tomiyasu, then once again, Arsenal could begin those left-hand side overloads to still have the men advantage down these left-hand zones and then look to penetrate through the midfield. A solid first win for the Gunners, and for the manager tactical score, Arsenal looked good in this win, aside from a couple of sloppy moments and not controlling the final stages of the game well enough, meaning Arteta still earns a solid 7. But what did you think? Drop it down below. And the visuals for this video are provided by the wonderful Metrica Sports, which is an amazing video analysis platform for coaches, players, or anyone wanted to make analysis videos like myself. It allows you to create and share amazing illustrated analysis videos in an intuitive manner. And the best part is, if you want to check it out, by using the code FootballMadeSimple at checkout, you can get a nice 5% discount.